Hey guys, so of course Unchained is considered as the best deck of the next format, so I thought what I would do is actually go through the topping Unchained deck list from the recent YCS events and just provide a data overview of this deck. So I think this will actually be helpful for both Unchained and non-Unchained players. For those of you playing Unchained, you'll be able to get a sense of what your other fellow Unchained players are running, and also for those of you who do not play the deck, then you just get a pretty good insight in terms of some of the cards that you need to watch out for that are being played in this deck. Now, of course, it is going to be slightly outdated in terms of the fact that, the recent YCS events are based on the current ban list, but you know what, I think most of the data presented in this video will still hold for the new format, and for cards that might change, then we can always have a discussion on that. So before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as always. Definitely also go check out those Team Sam sleeves. You can use my code Hakuna10 for 10% off, especially when you're trying to buy a lot of sleeves in bulk. So let's just provide a quick little overview for Unchained. Of course, in terms of the YCS tops, post-Duelist Nexus, it actually had the second most tops. Surprisingly enough, Kashtira actually still had more, especially more so because of that 3v3 event, which was the first YCS of this post-Duelist Nexus format, and Kashtira got a lot of that. Of course, moving into the next format post-ban list, Unchained probably will out first, and same thing can be said for regional top level. It was actually a little bit behind Kashtira and also slightly under Pearly, but again, maybe with Pearly it might be neck and neck. On Dueling Book, it was the second most played deck in the last 7 days. This might actually not be entirely accurate. I noticed that YGeoScope only recently started identifying Unchained, which means that it might not have actually started identifying for the full 7 days, so it actually might be the most played deck online at this point. 54% win percentage though. It's not too high though, but you know what, let's give it some time. Now, in terms of the deck size, so to start off, there were actually 18 topping deck lists from the YCS events that I could find that were used for this video in terms of Unchained lists. And the reason why I kind of like to look at deck size is that, in any kind of event, you are allowed to ask your opponent before the match starts, how many cards in your main deck, and sometimes that can kind of give things away. Now, of course, if you're playing against a deck like, let's say Flunder or Kashtira, they almost always play 40 cards, so it's a little bit hard to tell. With Unchained, it also looks like it's not going to be the easiest to tell. Kind of half of the list were playing 40, but, some were playing a little bit above. An example I like to give is, let's say with like Branded Despia, for example. Usually if you have a deck that's playing like 45 plus cards or 44 whatever, it's probably a good chance it was Branded Despia, at least depending on the format. So that's kind of an example where that deck size might actually be able to help you out in terms of finding out what they're playing. In terms of kind of like quote-unquote engine choices, I know Tour Guide has always been like a hot issue with Unchained players. So in the YCS topping deck list, 16 of the 18 deck lists were playing Tour Guide. But the funny thing is, the 2 lists that were not playing Tour Guide, that was actually from the YCS Sao Paulo, which was actually the first YCS, post-Duelist Nexus. But ever since then, all of the lists were actually playing Tour Guide. So obviously I'm not an expert in Unchained, but from what I had heard kind of at the initial stages was that, there was like this hot debate where a lot of people were saying, oh, don't play Tour Guide. So definitely let me know what you guys think in terms of if you do play Unchained, what your thoughts are, if you were sort of on that boat where you felt that you should not be playing Tour Guide, but now all these, topping deck lists are playing Tour Guide, did it change your mind? Did it not? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Another card that I think maybe is not so standard, but maybe will be, is the Wailing spell card for Unchained. So about a third of the total topping deck list played this card, but the 4 Unchained deck lists that were available for YCS Cancun, which is the most recent YCS event, they were actually all on this card. So maybe that's kind of a trend that you have to be aware of as well. Now, for those of you not familiar with this Wailing card, which I obviously wasn't either, but basically it looks like anytime you link summon an Unchained monster, you basically can target like a card on the field and destroy it. So it seems like a pretty good way to not only extend from Unchained perspective, but also going second, I guess it can also find a way to, break boards as well. Now, this is the list that won first place at YCS Vancouver, of course, by the one and only Jesse Khan. In terms of just to provide a quick deck cost breakdown, this exact list was actually like $700 USD, which is admittedly very, very expensive. But if you look closely, essentially, Jesse was main decking, 3 thrusts, which are very, very expensive, and the prosperities have also skyrocketed in price as well. Now, if you were to look at sort of the quote-unquote deck core for Unchained, unfortunately, it has also gone up quite a bit, just because, the Abomination Prison, the spell card, is actually I think like $27 each at the time of recording this video, so definitely kind of hefty. And then even in the extra deck, the Yamas have gone up a lot. It's like $20 each. Even the Soul of Rage is almost like $20 each as well, so it is a little bit on the higher side, but at the same time not really, because from the times that I've been doing these cost breakdowns, sometimes you have deck cores that are like $300. An example of that is kind of like Dragon Link, maybe like 2-3 months ago when Rebellion was very, very expensive. Even Branded Despia, when it wasn't even like a tier 1 deck, it was also like had a deck core of like $300 at one point not that long ago. So you know what, for those standards, and let's not forget Kashtira, when it was first tier 1, it was also incredibly expensive, even more than that. So I think for that standard, you know, Unchained is actually a decently reasonable price for tier 1 strategy. And definitely make sure to check out Card Brawlers or Tier 0 Games and use my code Hakuna5 for 5% off on Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles and supplies. So let's just provide a quick overview of the hand traps for Unchained lists that we're topping. So they actually had a median of 3 hand traps in the main, which is certainly lower than 9 seen in just on average of all the other decks that topped these YCS events. So that's kind of interesting. I guess they're not really playing too many hand traps in the main, but opting for board breakers instead. And also in the side, it was about 6 as a median compared to 5 for all other decks. In terms of going second board breaker cards, the median was 7 for these Unchained topping lists. And again, compared to kind of like overall all the decks that topped, it was a little bit higher because they had about 6 board breakers in the main. And then compared to that side, about 5 in the side rather for Unchained compared to 7 in the side for all other decks. So now let's just quickly go over some of the most played hand traps and staples as well in Unchained. Of course, we're going to start with Ashe, which is the case for all decks in general. If you saw my most recent YCS Top Cut breakdown videos, Ashe, super generic, really good against a lot of different strategies, so I think it's understandable. Nibiru is also interesting because this has definitely gone up because of, let's say, Unchained, but of course at the moment that, you know, this video is based on, you know, because we do still have Kashtira as of this current ban list, you know, Nibiru is also, of course, pretty good against that strategy. But even with Kashtira going out of the mix, at least in a tier 1 standpoint, in the next ban list format, I think Nibiru is still here to stay because, again, it can be quite good against Unchained as well. Imperm, I think this is at least among the hand traps that are being main among Unchained. This looks like this is the most common one in that regard. Droll definitely has fallen off in favor, especially in the recent events, but who knows, maybe that's where, you know, some, you know, I don't know, Manadium players or other kind of synchro combo heavy decks start taking advantage of that and start maybe get some more tops. Druid's Worm, this one's interesting because at least if you're playing any deck and you're going against Unchained, Druid's Worm is actually very good, even better than Magma Nut, which of course Magma Nut is now going to be put to 1 in the next list. But Druid's Worm on its own, not only can it banish, let's say, something like Yama, but because it also sends instead of destroying, so against Unchained it definitely is pretty critical. In terms of most common side deck staples, of course, starting with the Feather Duster, this was also kind of like the most played side deck staple in all decks in the recent YCS events. Talents, this is going to be very common in Unchained because, you know, for example, with like the rise of cards like Nibiru, they're kind of expecting that and they're going to be able to punish you. And also, especially in kind of like Unchained Mirrors or just in general, when you're going against Unchained, being able to take your opponent's monsters is definitely a lot more favorable than trying to destroy them when they kind of all float. So Book of Eclipse is something in particular going to be popular in Unchained just because you can set your own cards, or monsters rather, face down, which helps you kind of avoid being tributed off of by a nib. So that is something that can come up, and of course going second is really good. You know, again, in this the format that these lists were based on, we had Kashtira, so Book of Eclipse is very good against this strategy. But you know, even in the next format, we still have Pearly, for example, is going to be one of the best decks, and Book of Eclipse is still going to be quite good against them. We also have Thrust, of course, in combination with something like Talents. They're playing Talents and they're probably playing Thrust as well, so something that they can also set a lot of powerful traps going first that you'll see shortly. You also have Herald of the Abyss. This is another card you can actually search off of Thrust, for example, when you're going second, and definitely is a best way to out something like X Pearly Noir. Kind of interesting that even 2 Unchained lists were actually main decking this card. I guess you only have to main deck 1 because, you know, if you're playing Thrust, then you just have a versatile way of getting to that or any other kind of powerful normal spell or trap cards. You also have Book of Moon, you know, similar to the lines of Book of Eclipse. This is kind of interesting because when I did the Top Cut breakdown of all decks, Book of Moon was actually played a lot more than Book of Eclipse. But again, in Unchained in particular, they're going to be leaning towards Book of Eclipse. Again, not necessarily only because of that Nibiru interaction I mentioned, but at least that's a plus. We also have Change of Heart. This is certainly, again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of talents, you know, being able to take your opponent's monsters, especially when you know there's going to be a lot of Unchained decks out there, especially in the mirror. I'm assuming it's going to be very hopeful, so that's one of the reasons why I can see why Change of Heart is quite popular in these lists. Lightning Storm, this was actually quite popular in just among all decks as well, just being able to blow up back row or sometimes monsters as well. D-Barrier, unfortunately, you're still going to be seeing this, and, you know, Unchained, of course, is a deck that's not going to lose that hard to D-Barrier. They have a lot of link-based strategy. Of course, they have Caesar as like their Xyz, I guess. But, you know, other than that, like unlike something like, let's say, Chimera or Pearly, where they hard lose to something like D-Barrier, that's not going to be the case for Unchained. Next, we have Destructive Daruma Cannon, which has actually been quite popular lately as another way to set off of thrust other than D-Barrier, depending on the matchup. Of course, this card is very good against something like Keshira, and with Keshira presumably being out of like tier 1 status next format, this maybe would it see less play? I'm not too sure. I think it's still pretty good regardless. And then some other staples. Anti-Smell Fragrance being seen in a third of the Unchained list. I actually thought this was going to be a little bit more popular in the Unchained list. I felt like anytime I went against them, they were just playing this against me. But at the same time, you know, this is why it's kind of nice to have like actual like data breakdown of things, just to know how common these cards are actually played. Of course, with the caveat that it's only based on the Unchained deck lists that were publicly available. We also have Fenrir. This is another card that I know is pretty popular in not just, you know, of course Unchained, but a lot of different decks. You know what, we're going to be seeing a lot of this card, and just being able to banish cards face down again, something like Unchained is actually going to be very, very good, just so that you're not destroying things. Evenly Match definitely has been going down in popularity among like all decks in general. Kind of surprising, obviously against Unchained themselves. It's not like particularly amazing because they are actually able to kind of recover quite well. You know, they can keep the Caesar and then they can just kind of pop and float things back after the Evenly. So you know what, I guess it's kind of understandable as well. Kaiju. So interestingly enough, the more recent, or rather the earlier topping deck lists, the Unchained ones, some of them were playing like Kaiju. A lot of Kaijus actually. This is in the Sao Paulo YCS. But recently, I don't think I've seen any of them really play Kaijus, whether in the main or the side as well. And then lastly, this is Trap Tracks, which I'm sure a lot of you probably aren't aware of. I certainly wasn't either. I actually covered this in one of the YCS Top Cut breakdown videos, but basically it looks like just kind of a way to, you know, not only destroy your own monster, but also set like a trap from your deck, which I'm sure is kind of like a neat tech choice. But you know what, this I believe was only really seen in the earlier YCS events, post Duelist Nexus with, you know, Unchained, but in the recent topping list, I didn't see them playing this. Alright, so that was it for the data breakdown of Unchained based on the topping YCS deck list. Hopefully you found that helpful. I do really like to do these kind of videos, and I hope to do it for other decks. But you know what, these videos typically don't end up doing too well. But you know what, if you did like it, definitely leave a comment down below. I'll certainly read it and appreciate it. Anyways, thank you again all for watching. A huge thanks to my Patreons as always for their continued support, and well, take care guys.